Thus far, we've been thinking about directors and officers' duties, about what people need to do in these leadership positions, rather kind of euphemistically, like who can have them, what power they have, and then who they owe the duty to. Let's get into some detail about what they actually are. As this slide here suggests, there are three core ways of thinking about the duties that directors and officers, right? So one of the things to remember is everything we talk about here, with the possible exception of solvency, which we'll deal with in week 4, applies to directors and officers and other employees, a lot of it, when we get to the detail of the Corporations Act. So most people involved in business life are going to hold these same kinds of duties, maybe not to the same extent, but they're still going to hold the same kind of principle in play. Because when you're in business, when you're acting in a company, when you're working, you're not acting for yourself, you're acting for someone else. And so these kinds of common law duties arise, and we've codified a lot of them into the Corporations Act. So I'm going to classify the kinds of duties that we owe into three core areas. The first one is to act honestly and avoid conflict. So really this is about not self-dealing. Okay, this is hardcore fiduciary. Okay, so you're in a position of trust, you're acting for someone else, you need to act honestly and avoid conflicts. The second area is that you've got to take due care and diligence. You've got to apply yourself, right? So this is really about not being negligent. I don't want to get into the technicality because technically this is still a fiduciary duty, but I think it's fundamentally different from this self-dealing. Okay, so I'm going to call these self-dealing our fiduciary, and then due care and diligence is a little bit different. It's about applying yourself, and that has changed over time. The legal interpretation of how much we need to apply ourselves, particularly as directors, has changed. And then finally, there's a whole series of duties that are in statute, mainly in statute, some in common law, but mainly in statute, that say, look, you are obliged as a director to do certain things. So they're going to vary by the kind of company that you are. For instance, if you're a mining company, the Mining Act might impose particular obligations on you. So this is saying, look, if you get into a position as a director or officer, you need to look at what duties you actually owe, and that might mean taking a deeper look or getting someone else to have a deep look for you at what the statutory duties of the position actually are. So let's deal with these one at a time, first starting with this fiduciary idea, this acting honestly and avoiding conflicts. So the heart of being a director and officer is, as I stated just before, you're acting for someone else, for the company, not for yourself. That puts you in a position of trust. Okay, there's some variations technically that you're not actually like a trustee, but it's that same kind of relationship. Other fiduciary relationships include things like a parent-child relationship, a lawyer-client, a doctor-patient, right? Because you have the power to do something that can affect someone else. Therefore, you're under an obligation to act for them, not yourself. This is very clearly the case when we're directors and officers, when we're directing the company, when we're the mind and the hands of the company. We need to be acting for the company, not our self-interest. So there's a range of common law or case law and statutory provisions that govern this. Most people would be captured by the statutory provisions. That's where you're going to end up legally. Remember, though, that the way the law operates, it doesn't mean that the common law rules don't apply. It's just once they've been codified, they're often a bit easier to make out, and in some ways they're a little bit broader. Okay, so let's look at what these actually are. The first one requires that you act in good faith. Okay, so that's kind of like acting honestly, but really importantly, it also says you've got to act for a proper purpose. So even if you act honestly, right, that may mean that you're not acting for a proper purpose. So you actually have to look at the act or the decision that you undertake and go, why are you doing that? Are you doing that for why you should do that act? Or are you doing it for some ulterior motive? Okay, so you can authorize the purchase of something, right? And so the proper purpose for authorising a purchase, right, is to get supply into the company, etc. Authorising a purchase maybe to in order to build up some personal sense of reciprocity with someone. That's not a proper purpose. Okay, so even if you're doing it honestly, even if you think it's good for the company, it's not a proper purpose. So they're subtly different, right? So acts and decisions must be made in good faith for a proper purpose. You must avoid conflicts of interest, and conflicts of interest at the board or group level need to be managed. Okay, we'll deal a bit more in detail with this, but a conflict of interest really occurs where the decision is going to affect both the company's interest and your own interest. Now remember, you should be acting for the company. So what the law tries to do is to say, look, you need to be really careful in these situations because you might not even know that you're making a decision for yourself. You can be maybe subconsciously or consciously biased. So we want to remove that bias from the decision making. That's the point of this particular provision. A third element here is that you can't misuse your position. So the position of director needs to be executed for the good of the company, and you can't misuse information. Okay, so the information you get as a director and officer is the property of the company. It's not yours. So you shouldn't be using it for other purposes. I think a fantastic case that gets to the heart of conflict of interest is Blakey Brothers and Aberdeen Railway. So in this particular instance, you had an individual, Mr. Blakey, who was a director and owner of Blakey Brothers and also a director of the Aberdeen Railway Company. Blakey Brothers actually made railway sleepers. And where do you think the Aberdeen Railway Company bought their railway sleepers from? Of course, Blakey Brothers. So the key point that the judge makes in this decision, he says, Mr. Blakey, look, how can you get the highest possible price for the railway sleepers when you're acting as a director for Blakey Brothers, at the same time as you're trying to get the lowest possible price for sleepers for the Aberdeen Railway Company, right? There's an obvious conflict of there that you can't reconcile. So you shouldn't actually be involved in that decision. Technically, this is really more of a conflict of duties than a conflict of interest, right? And often we suffer conflicts of duties. But it goes to the heart of leaving kind of an impenetrable problem when we're conflicted. So the law has evolved a number of ways of handling conflicts. Under the Corporations Law, Section 195 has two different approaches depending upon whether you're a PTY Ltd, proprietary limited company, or an LTD, a limited company. Right? Under a PTY Ltd, which is a smaller, tightly held company, you just have to notify the other directors that you have this conflict of interest. The idea here is that the other directors can then take action against you, and not take action against you, that the other directors can then counter the bias you might introduce into the decision making. Now, note, if you act self-interestedly, you're misusing your position and/or you're not acting bona fide for a proper purpose. So you're still not allowed to make a decision for the wrong reason, but you can take part because the other directors will probably counter that bias in smaller, tightly held companies. Now, look, in broader limited companies where you can raise money from the general public, the law takes a more stringent view. It says actually in these situations you can't even be involved in the decision unless all the other directors say you can. So there's some provisions there which I'll leave you to go through in detail, but you've essentially got to leave the room and let the others vote on whether you can participate or not. So in reality, what it's trying to do is to say, look, the board is actually a group, right? So it's not just down to one director's vote. So the countering, what we don't want though is this unmitigated bias entering the decision. So you've at least got to notify the other directors, even a PTY Ltd, so that they can know what your motivation might be and/or not participate, or at least not participate unless the other directors let you if it's a broadly held company. So it's one of the things you need to think about here in terms of this is what we actually do to implement this. And we'll get to that when we get to Module 3, which is about policy and process, because there are technical elements. For instance, a conflict of interest is defined as a material conflict of interest. Well, what's material, right? So there are some quite difficult questions that often policy and process helps you work through. If we get into use of position or use of information, these are actually legislated, right? So if I go back to our original idea of the 4, what we can see here is Section 181. This has been codified into the Corps Act. Misuse of position, 182, 183. And so these are kind of structured together as the self-dealing. The conflict of interest we learnt was Section 195 tells us what to do around conflict of interest. Okay, so what I want to do is just deal with one of these provisions. I've taken an excerpt. Remember, you can go on to OSLI, and which will have the Corporations Act in it, and you can search for the Corporations Act and find the actual section. So this is what the codified area says. Use of position. Directors, other officers and employees, right? So this provision captures virtually everyone who works for a firm. So a director, secretary, other officer or employee of a corporation must not improperly use their position to gain an advantage for themselves. Okay, so that's our self-dealing, or someone else, right? So it's not even about self-dealing, and it doesn't even say you need to be related to them. So if you use your position to gain an advantage for someone else, right, that will be a breach of this provision, or to cause detriment to the corporation. Okay, so you're not allowed to use your position to harm the corporation either. So this is replicated in use of information, right? You're not allowed to use information to gain advantage for yourself or someone else or cause detriment to the corporation. I think it's really worth looking at those words because we see the broad scope of who is captured by the provision. And we also see that it's not just about self-dealing, it's anyone else and detriment. The final area for us to think about is this misuse of information. Right? So the core aspect of this area of law is that information that you gain as being a director or officer or employee is the property of the company, right? And you've got to respect that confidential nature of that information and the fact that it's not yours. So that's the core area of using information, misusing. So you're not allowed to misuse information. You're not allowed to misuse position. You should avoid conflicts of interest, and you should act bona fide for a proper purpose. And that really is the core of the fiduciary self-dealing aspect of your legal duties. There's a number of provisions in there, but at heart, they're all going to the same thing, right? The fact that you should be acting for the company and not for yourself. Next, we're going to have a bit of a look at the second area of duty, which is due care and diligence.